Our second speaker this morning is Liana Buchanan. Liana is the Principal Commissioner for Children and Young People. Now, prior to her appointment as Commissioner in April last year, her roles included being the Executive Officer of the Federation of Community Legal Centres, where she led a sort of a peak body for Victoria's 50 community legal centres. And she's also Director of the Office of Correctional Services Review, where she's responsible for monitoring Victoria's correction system. Would you please welcome Liana Buchanan? Thank you.
Thank you. I too will start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on today, the Dja Dja Wurrung, and pay my deep respects to their elders past and present, and indeed future elders, which is important to me, particularly bearing in mind my role as Children's Commissioner. When I acknowledge country, I acknowledge the harms that have been done to the first peoples of this land. And we see the legacy of those harms in most parts of society that we care to look. But for the purposes of the conversation this morning, let's look at youth justice and just bear in mind that Koori kids are 12 times more likely to be in the youth justice centres that we are talking about today. And if you look nationally, the figures are even worse. Look, thank you so much for inviting me to talk justice today on a topic that has consumed a lot of my attention in recent months. When I was thinking about what to talk about, I held off until the very last moment. Damien and Claudia, who I spoke to during the week, can affirm that. But that was primarily because this has been such a volatile area, has been such a movable feast. If I think about when the organisers of this program would have settled the topic for this morning's session, nobody would have known whether the children Claudia's just been talking about would still be in the Barwon prison or whether they'd be moved. Now, as we've just heard, just over a week ago, the Supreme Court handed down the latest decision, and those children and young people have been moved out of Barwon, for which I think we can all be pretty pleased and relieved. And I think in part what that means is that we can have a slightly different conversation this morning. We can have a conversation, certainly this is what I'm keen to do, that reflects a bit about how the prospect of children in an adult maximum security prison ever came about, how we can try and stop it from coming about again, and what are the remaining ongoing issues in the youth justice system. Because as I'll come back to, I'm very, very keen to emphasise that our work is not done. The decision was a significant one just over a week and a half ago, but we have a lot of work to do. In this session, we've been asked to look at the Victorian Government's response to the riots in November that Claudia has taken us through. And I'll do that, but I'm going to look a bit more broadly than November, because I think, and Claudia herself has taken us through some of that, we've got to look at those riots in context, what led up to those, and we've got to look at the Victorians' actions in context as well. As Commissioner for Children and Young People, part of my role is to monitor and provide oversight to systems that affect vulnerable children. And there's a specific focus in the legislation that sets up my role on vulnerable children, which includes child protection, out-of-home care and youth justice. I have to say, when I came into my role just over a year ago, not that long, I thought that the high-profile stuff that I'd be dealing with would be in the child protection and out-of-home care space. I didn't for a second imagine we'd be where we are today on youth justice. I thought youth justice, from a bit of a distance, was pretty settled. I also thought the community conversation about youth justice was relatively settled. I thought there were a number of accepted fundamentals, if you like, that were accepted not only in the community, largely with the occasional blip within the media, and importantly, across all sides of the political spectrum. I thought that it was a given that we needed a separate youth justice system to deal with children who offend, that reflected some of the differences that Claudia's taken us through about children, the fact that their brains are still well and truly developing, and that has a whole range of different implications. I thought that it was a given that we should have a system that should focus on rehabilitation as its primary purpose. I thought it was a given that we should have a system that recognises the vulnerability of children and the fact that most children who get caught up in offending, to the extent they end up in youth justice centres, have experienced significant disadvantage and, in large part, incredible trauma. The stats, hopefully if you've been listening to advocates, you'll have some of these stats. If you've just been paying attention to the media, you won't. But 2/3 of the kids in the youth justice centres in Victoria have been involved in child protection and under orders in the past or are under child protection orders now. That means 2/3 have been involved in and victims of abuse, neglect, trauma, the kind that most people happily can't even imagine. When you look at the extent of mental health issues, we've got 1/3 of the kids in those centres have diagnosed mental health issues, let alone the undiagnosed, and 1/5, almost a quarter in fact, have impaired cognitive functioning. That's just a few of the aspects of the children that we're talking about that are worth bearing in mind. I thought that it was a given that we needed to pay attention to the evidence that tells us that punitive, restrictive approaches aren't only inhumane when we're talking about the younger members of our community, but they don't work. They actually compound the harm. And I thought that the kind of tough-on-crime narrative that we are so familiar with in the adult space, we're so familiar with when it comes to adults who offend, I thought that for children, we were a little bit protected from that. I was wrong. All of these supposed fundamentals are now far from accepted truths in our community dialogue and our political dialogue. We have a new narrative. Claudia's taken us through some of that. But I'll go back. I'll go to March last year, just before I started as Commissioner, as it happens, and the Moomba weekend and what's now widely known as the Moomba Riots. And really what I saw from there, right through in the lead up to November, and we'll deal with post-November in a minute, an absolute steady, almost relentless focus on youth offending. Often, of course, as we know and we've seen, with a particular racial focus. And it was, it really was relentless. Every week, if not every day, we'd see stories on the home invasions and the carjackings. We'd see a mounting narrative about a youth crime wave, even though, as we've heard, the numbers of young people who offend are going down, and in fact what we were talking about and what we were seeing profiled was a relatively small number of a couple of hundred. So the Victoria Police says at the most it's about 500 young people. The Crime Stats Agency says it's about 200. Either way, we're talking about hundreds, not thousands or more, hundreds of young people caught in this pattern of more serious offending. So there's a new narrative. We have to clamp down on violent teen thugs. We have to toughen our penalties and create new offences. We need a supermax facility for young people. We see the government in May last year absolutely lambasted for being soft on crime because the government reversed some bail changes that had, over the prior 3 years, led to a massive hike in the number of children being remanded. Again, Claudia alluded to this, but at Parkville, we now have on any given day 80% of the kids in there are on remand. A few years ago, it was the other way around, it would be 20%, so there's been a massive hike. But when the government made attempts to address that, it was roundly criticised. We've seen calls for an end to the differential approach to children who commit crime. So this was the dominant narrative in the lead up to November. It was the opposition, it was the mainstream media in spades, it was the Police Association, it was the union, the CPSU, a very varied and growing range of stakeholders really calling for a tougher approach to kids. And at the same time, what was happening inside the youth justice centres is that they were becoming less settled, or at least the extent to which they were less settled was becoming more visible. We saw an increasing number of incidents that then played out in the media and added fuel to people's alarm and tension. So that was the context up until November. But if I thought that we'd strayed from the accepted fundamentals, as I call them, before November, I hadn't really seen anything yet. Claudia's talked to us about the riot in mid-November. As she said, it caused massive damage to the centre, putting 60 beds out of action. There was, at that point, a very real capacity problem that government had to contend with. I understood that at the time, and for that reason, my position publicly and generally was, I think we have to look for other options beside Barwon, and I think we have to keep looking for them because Barwon is not a good option. But if government is adamant in that emergency situation that there are no other options, then what's really important is that the children who move to Barwon are treated in a way that's comparable with the way they're treated in the other centres, at least, that they're managed by youth justice staff, and that they don't experience a worsening of conditions and a lesser access to some of the things they need because of those decisions. So again, we've heard that children were moved into Barwon. I was pretty dismayed the first time I went to visit children, and that was 2 days after the first had been moved in there. As Damien mentioned, one of my past roles was to head up the unit that oversees the adult corrections system in the Department of Justice. So the last time I'd been into Barwon was when we were investigating the death of Carl Williams. It was pretty grim to go in there to visit and talk with 15-year-old boys. And it was more grim when I went in and saw the way those children were being treated. Now, conditions changed and improved over time, but in those early weeks particularly, they were appalling. There was standard 23-hour lockdown for all children. That translates to just 1 hour out of cell. That's kind of probably a more compelling way to remember to phrase it. And all the issues that Claudia mentioned were playing out. Kids hadn't had any phone contact with family. They weren't having visits. They were at that stage having no fresh air time and didn't for a few weeks. There were a whole range of pretty appalling circumstances that led me, and this is well and truly on the public record because the Ombudsman's published all my letters to the Minister from that period, but it led me to write to the Minister saying we are keeping children in harsher conditions than the most restrictive regime available in the adult corrections system, and that was absolutely the case. Now, as I've said, conditions improved gradually, although sometimes they went backwards. By January again, I was raising concerns with the Minister that although not all children were being locked down for 23 hours, that was a fairly common occurrence whenever there had been an incident or some misbehaviour. There was a standard application of what's called a separation plan with a standard 23-hour lockdown component. And when those children were let out for their 1 hour, they were on handcuffs for the entire time, again, not subject to any particular risk assessment, and a whole range of other problems playing out, as well as staff shortages, and I'll come back to this when I talk about the rest of the system, but also at Grevillea, staff shortages sometimes were meaning that children, even if they hadn't been involved in an incident, were only able to get out of their cell for 3 hours a day. And of course, and this is worth remembering, later in January we had Corrections Victoria staff based in the Grevillea unit, armed with batons and capsicum spray, full-time mixing and there as part of the staffing complement. So some of my absolute preconditions around if we're going to have kids in this environment, we have to mitigate the impact and we absolutely have to make sure that they're still managed by youth justice staff. Well, that well and truly shifted as time went on. So my answer to one of the questions posed for us this morning, should children be transferred to adult prisons, Of course not. Grevillea is a unit that is unmistakably designed and built for adult maximum security prisoners. It's harsh, it's bleak, it's unforgiving, it's cold, it's incredibly contained. Talking to kids as I have done and did over the months that they were there, they found the very environment pretty hard and pretty frightening at times. Its infrastructure alone there makes it inappropriate for children, particularly when you think about the backgrounds of these children, the fact that we are talking about children who are by very definition, by their very age, they are vulnerable and they're still developing cognitively and emotionally, but also many of them have backgrounds not only of disengagement and exclusion but significant trauma. But I think one of the most significant things that I would add is the infrastructure alone was a problem, but actually the way that the system was working with those children and treating those children actually made things much, much worse. There were several points in time over the months that the children and young people were in Grevillea, particularly those early months, that I was really conscious that although I, in my role as someone who can scrutinise the system, was going in to Grevillea frequently, and Commission staff were going in either twice a week or after the initial few months once a week. And although I was raising my concerns with the Minister fairly frequently by letter and increasingly speaking out about my concerns, I wasn't always taking exactly the same line as other advocates. I wasn't, and held off at any point from saying get the kids out of Grevillea no matter what. And the reason that I didn't do that was because it seemed clear that, right or wrong, if government was going to move the kids out of Grevillea, they were going to move them into Parkville and Malmsbury, where there were still, up until relatively recently, there were still 60 beds short and there were some pretty significant capacity problems. But I'd been worried about those centres since almost as soon as I walked into the role. I'm on the public record talking about some of the things that I've seen in the past year in Parkville and Malmsbury. I'm on the public record talking about the fact that I've had reason to do several reviews into incidents where children have had limbs broken through inappropriate restraints. I'm on the record talking about the fact that at Parkville, children, the younger boys, 10 to 14, and the girls have been subject at times to routine handcuff regimes whenever they leave their unit. So just to go to programs or just to go to gym, they've been put on handcuffs. I'm on record talking about one of our community visitors who saw one day that a young child had blood on the back of their top. And when they looked at it, it was because those handcuffs were opening up self-harm wounds. I'm on public record because I've tabled a report in Parliament about this, that we have looked over the past couple of years at the extent of isolation and lockdowns in our youth justice centres. I'm on record saying that when we looked at that, and we looked at it very closely, and it took us some time because the recording and the data, frankly, was very, very hard to find and even at the end of it incomplete. But what we found clear evidence of was excessive use of isolation as a major behaviour management tool, if not the main behaviour management tool. We found evidence of children and young people kept in isolation for up to 40 days at a time. We found evidence of children being kept in isolation spaces at Parkville where there are no sanitation facilities and children were forced to relieve themselves in the cells on the floor. We found evidence when we watched footage of children who were in isolation spaces because there were a risk of self-harm, banging their heads for 6 minutes or more against the wall with no intervention from any staff member. And on top of all of that, we found evidence that, again, for at least the last few years, but actually the evidence suggests longer, staff shortages at centres have meant that children have been frequently locked in their cells and secluded and not able to go to education or access the other programs they need. again, not because they've misbehaved, not because they've been involved in any incident or because they're a risk to themselves or others, just because we haven't been able to get enough staff to open up units. When we looked at the data, we found that on average, over the 18-month period that we looked at, which was actually before November last year, that 18-month period finished in mid-2016, on average every day there was at least one unit of 15 kids locked down, at least for an hour, often for a couple of hours, sometimes half a day, sometimes longer. So I guess what I want to encourage us to do today, and I'll finish here, is yes, we absolutely have to think about how it came to pass that we had kids in Grevillea. We absolutely have to be pleased and relieved that the courts gave our decision makers a reminder that the rights of these children matter and that we do need to protect and have a separate system for kids. But I'm pretty keen to make sure that we also have the conversation about the situation for children and young people who are in Parkville and Malmsbury today, about how we go about rebuilding what was once seen as a progressive, rehabilitative, effective system in Victoria, one that not only supported children and young people, but ultimately was able to make the community safer because it actually supported them to stop reoffending. How do we rebuild that? And importantly, and this is where I come back to the narrative, how do we make it possible that our politicians of all different colours think that it's going to be popular and politically acceptable to do that work? Thank you.